Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is, what are we calling this? This is weekly teaching number, sorry, I had it written down here, number 3, and today we're talking about Genesis chapters 15 through 21, because that's what we've been reading in the daily Bible reading. And what I wanted to focus on today specifically as we review this is to focus specifically on Abraham, the man, first called Abram, as we saw, and then God changed his name to Abraham. And I wanted to talk about how central a character he is in the Bible. Obviously not as central as Jesus, but aside from that, you know, very, very important throughout the Bible, referred to by Jesus and others, and let's just talk a bit about how important he is. And as part of that, I'd like to do a little bit of a survey of how Abraham was referred to in the Bible after the stories we're reading, so that we can sort of use that to inform what we are reading. So first, let me just go through some statistics to give you some sense of the place Abraham has in the Bible. He dies in the 25th chapter of Genesis, which we'll get to next week. And up until that point, he's mentioned in 95 verses of Genesis. From Genesis 1:1, of course, the first time I think he's mentioned is in Genesis 11:26, something like that. So say from Genesis 11 to Genesis 25, where he dies, that the stories are primarily about him. And he's mentioned in 95 verses. Now, after, that's as Abraham. Now, he's also mentioned in 49 verses as Abram. So if you add those together, you know, you get something like 100. I should never try to add, you know, when I'm doing something live. But so you had 49 minus 5, so it's 144 times that he's mentioned in Genesis up until the time that he dies, if you count the times he's called Abraham and the time he's called Abram. Now, after that, though, he's mentioned 136 times. So he's mentioned in almost as many verses after he dies as he was during all those stories about when he was alive. And that includes verses both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. For example, in the book of Genesis alone, he's mentioned in another 24 verses after Genesis 25:8, where he dies. Then he's mentioned 9 times in the book of Exodus. In the book of Leviticus, he's mentioned once. In Numbers, he's mentioned once. And in Deuteronomy, he's mentioned 7 times. So in the 5 books of Moses, he's mentioned a total of 42 times after he dies. And then Joshua through Malachi, he gets mentioned another 24 times. And then in the New Testament, he's mentioned 70 times. So if you take the times he's mentioned in the books of Moses after he dies, the time he's mentioned in the Old Testament after the books of Moses, and the times he's mentioned in the New Testament, that comes out to a total of 136 times. Whereas, as I say, it was 144, well, actually 142 before he died. So you mentioned almost as many times after as before. He was very, very important. He was, of course, the beginning of the people of God. He, you know, who came to be called the Hebrews or the Jews or the Israelites. And let me just read to you just a few of the verses in which he was mentioned in the Old Testament after he died, and then we'll go to the New Testament. Now, to be sure, a lot of these mentions were just very brief. It would say, like, I serve the God of Abraham, or I serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then it would go on. But some of them have a little more to them. For example, in Isaiah 41, excuse me, these pages are a little thin in this Bible I'm reading from, and it's not easy. Maybe I should go to another one. Isaiah 41:8. God is speaking through Isaiah, and he says to his people, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend." Now that's an interesting statement from God. Descendant of Abraham, my friend. Those two words added there, my friend. That is really something that God would call a human being his friend. But he does. And we'll get to this again in the New Testament, because in the book of James, James quotes this. But, you know, this gives you an idea why Abraham is so central. God considered him his friend because he did God's will. Then later on in the book of Isaiah, in verse, well, excuse me, I'm just going to get Bible where the pages are broken in a little bit more. This, by the way, this is an older one. It's the 1977 version of the New American Standard. Most of the ones that are published today are the 1995 version. The main difference being that the 1995 version takes out the these and thous. There's a few other differences, but that's the most noticeable difference. Other than that, they're pretty close. So let's see, this was Isaiah 51. And Isaiah says, again on behalf of God, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who gave you birth in pain. When he was one, I called him. Then I blessed him and multiplied him." Of course, that was part of the promise to Abraham. God would bless him. He'd bless those that blessed him, curse those who cursed him, and that he would multiply him. And of course, he gave him many, many descendants. But this little short passage is rich. It has so many other things in it. He says, "Look to the rock from which you were hewn." And he invokes Abraham and Sarah. And, you know, the rock, the stone, this image of rock and stone runs throughout the Old Testament, and then we see it again in the New Testament. In Daniel, the Messiah is this special stone. In the book of Psalms 118, chapter 118, it says, "The stone which the builders rejected became the chief cornerstone." And here this stone is likened to Abraham. When he was one, I called him. And this idea that from one, God could create a multitude. And of course, that imagery foreshadows what would happen through Jesus, through that one human life, that one exemplary human life, I should say. God can multiply that life through us. So Jesus is our example. We imitate him, and as we imitate him, then that life gets multiplied over and over. Let's see what else we've got here. Ezekiel, we'll look at real quickly. Ezekiel 33 and verse 24. Ezekiel, this is God speaking to Ezekiel, "Son of man, they who live in these waste places in the land of Israel are saying, Abraham was only one, yet he possessed the land. So to us who are many, the land has been given as a possession." And then he goes on and gives his message to him. So again, that imagery of Abraham being only one, from this one person, and a very old person at that, God gives a child in his old age, and his wife was advanced in age as well, though not quite as much as he was. And from that one very unlikely source, God created this great nation, which would be led by David, and then in its greatest glory through his son Solomon. And then the last New Testament verse I want to mention quickly is Micah. And this is the very last verse of Micah, chapter 7, verse 20. "Thou wilt give truth to Jacob, and unchanging love to Abraham, which thou didst swear to our forefathers from the days of old." So that theme of God made promises to Abraham, and we, his descendants, are both the fulfillment of those promises, at least of some of them, and secondly, we are the heirs of those promises. Because we're descended from Abraham, the promises God made to him inure to our account, and we can lay claim to those promises because of that. So that's just a sampling of the verses that came, maybe close to 40 or 50 verses that came in the Old Testament after Abraham died. He was very, very important because it wasn't just like, hey, he was an exemplary figure. It was that he was an exemplary figure, but also he was the means by which God would make promises to his people. God didn't have to promise over and over again every time a new generation came along, because each generation inherited those promises from the prior ones. Now, there were some generations like Esau who didn't value the promises, didn't value the inheritance. But those generations like Jacob would value the inheritance and cling to it. Just like today, there are people that don't value the Bible. This has been handed down to us from our ancestors. And this is the most precious inheritance we could have. And they don't value it. And as a result, they don't benefit from it, and keep themselves in a cursed place rather than being in a place of blessing. So if we look at the New Testament, Abraham is, of course, mentioned in the genealogies. There's a genealogy for Jesus in Matthew 1, which shows that his roots go back to Abraham. That's to prove that he deserved to receive the promises of Abraham. And, one of the things that's made clear as you read the Bible is that Jesus just did so much more with those promises than any other Israelite had done. Now, granted, he was the Messiah, and therefore there were promises to him that not every descendant of Abraham got. But even the promises of Abraham, he knew how to live his life according to those promises. And that's one of the reasons why you and I read the Bible, to understand the covenant that we have with God through Jesus Christ, so that we can know those promises and keep his commandments. Those are the two sides of the ledger, so to speak. God makes promises and we keep commandments. And the two go together. And that's part of the relationship. And actually they're reversible, because the commandments become our promises to God, and the promises become the commandments that he keeps. Now, since he made the promises, he's commanding himself. It's not like we're commanding him, but he is really honest, and so when he makes promises, he's going to keep them. So a promise to him, a promise that he makes, is just like a commandment. It's something he's got to keep. It's a commandment he gives himself. Which, by the way, we should treat our promises the same way too. We should be slow to promise, and when we do promise something, we should keep it. When you get married, you promise to be faithful to the other person. You need to treat that like it's a commandment. I'm going to do that. I got to do it because I promised it. It gets added into the commandment. God commands us to do certain things. Don't kill, don't steal, don't covet, and so on. And don't commit adultery. But then when we make promises to a spouse, we are supposed to keep them, and it becomes just like another commandment to us. So we should be slow to make promises, because how many commandments can we bear? But beyond the genealogies, there's other places where Abraham is mentioned. Now, this is actually John the Baptist talking, although Jesus expressed similar thoughts. It says, I'm reading from Matthew 3 and verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore, bring forth fruit in keeping with your repentance, and do not suppose that you can say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham for our father.' For I say to you that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Don't say to yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. For I say to you that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. So the descendants of Abraham had learned over time through the lessons of the Old Testament and the history that we read there to value the promises that God made to Abraham. So they had that part down right. But they were missing some humility, and they thought God was blessing them just because they were physical descendants of Abraham. And John is telling them, look, God is able to raise up from these stones children to Abraham. I mean, he's God. He can create anything. You're not special because of who you were born to. You may have some special promises that are given to you, but it doesn't mean you can live any old way you want to. You're still a human being. You still get judged by God's standards. And if God has given you the revelation that he gave to Abraham, if you've inherited that, then the standard expected of you is higher than it is of all these Gentile people. That's the point John is trying to get across to these people. And they just weren't understanding that. No, they were taking pride in the fact that they were descendants of Abraham. Just like people today, you'll see them take pride. Well, we're Christians. And a lot of people, what they mean by that is, well, we're not Jews, and we're not Muslims, and we're not Buddhist, and we're not Hindu. Well, we're Christians. And it's just a social or a cultural thing to them. They don't have any personal commitment to Jesus as a person. They don't honor him in their hearts. They don't submit their thought life to his guidance and his commandments. And they've got the same attitude as these Pharisees here. Let's see, Matthew 8:11. I can see now from the time I'm not going to be able to read all these. So when you see the notes in the blog post, there'll be more verses than what I've read. And I haven't tried to be exhaustive. I mean, you can use an online concordance and find all the references to Abraham, and they'll match up to those numbers that I show you. But I'm not going to list all of them out, just a sampling. Here in Matthew 8:11, Jesus says, and I say to you, that many shall come from east and west, and recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast into the outer darkness, and in that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Jesus is telling his fellow Jews, look, many are going to come from east and west. He was prophesying that there would be many Gentiles who would accept him as the Jewish Messiah. But the sons of the kingdom, in other words, people like these very Pharisees he's talking to right here, they're going to be cast out of the kingdom. They're not part of it. And sure enough, the very leaders who condemned Jesus to death, they ended up losing everything, because in 70 AD, the Romans came in, destroyed Jerusalem, and brought a complete end to Israel as a nation. And they were scattered, the Jews were scattered throughout the earth, and they completely missed the kingdom of God. Jesus was bringing them the kingdom of God in himself. They rejected him, so they stayed outside the kingdom. Then Matthew 22 and 32, Jesus says something interesting referencing Abraham. He's challenged about the resurrection. The Sadducees didn't think there was any resurrection. And so he says to him, regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. He's quoting words that were spoken to Moses from the burning bush. And what God said at that time to Moses was, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Jesus' point was, he said, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to Moses. You see, all three of those guys were dead by the time Moses, they've been dead for hundreds of years. So his point was, look, Sadducees, if you were right, then God would have said to Moses, I was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But he didn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So obviously, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still existed at the time of Moses. Let's see what I can skip over here. He talked about a woman that he healed. He said she was a daughter of Abraham, ought not she to be healed? He talked about Zacchaeus. This too was a son of Abraham. And Jesus, he conducted his entire ministry to Jews. He never went more than 200 miles away from Jerusalem. He just basically covered that area of Palestine or Israel, ancient Israel. And he did not preach to the Gentiles. And remember when that Syrophoenician woman came, she was a type of Gentile. When she came to him and she wanted her daughter to be healed, at first he said, no, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. She kept pressing him, and he capitulated. And he said, I haven't seen this great of faith in Israel. His mission was to the Jews. The time for the Gentiles would come after he was raised from the dead. And even then, it didn't come right away, because if you read the book of Acts, in the beginning, in the first few chapters, it's all Jews preaching to Jews. It wasn't until chapter 10 that the first Gentiles actually heard the message and believed. And from there on, it starts about Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. But Jesus was focused very much on the Jews in his earthly ministry. I do want to read from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, beginning at verse 33. This is right before that. Jesus said that well-known verse where he says, if you abide in my word, then you're truly disciples of mine. You'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And then they answered him. These are the Jewish religious leaders. We are Abraham's offspring and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you shall become free? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin, and the slave does not remain in the house forever. The son does remain forever. Therefore, if therefore the Son shall make you free, you should be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's offspring, yet you seek to kill me, because my word has no place in you. I speak these things which I have seen with my father, therefore you also do the things which you have heard from your father. They answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. In other words, if you're Abraham's children, act like him. But as it is, you're seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You are doing the deeds of your father. They said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. That's probably an allusion to what people were saying about the virgin birth. If they didn't believe the virgin birth, then they obviously believed that his mother had sinned when he was conceived, because she wasn't yet married to Joseph. Verse 42, Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I'm saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar, the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this reason you do not hear them, because you are not of God. The Jews answered and said to him, do we not rightly say that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. But I do not seek my glory, for there is one who seeks and judges. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, and the prophets also. And you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste of death. Surely you are not greater than our father Abraham, who died. They probably read Genesis 25:8 too. The prophets died too. Whom do you make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And you have not come to know him. But I know him. And if I say that I do not know him, I shall be a liar like you. But I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoice to see my day. And he saw it and was glad. Now that's interesting because we don't read in the chapters in Genesis that we're reading about Abraham an explicit statement where Abraham says that. But he did see Messiah, because Jesus is telling us he did. And when we get to the chapter about, which I think is tomorrow, about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, he considered that Isaac was going to be raised from the dead. When God postponed that, then to me that sounds like a good place for Abraham to figure, well, okay, so Isaac's not the Messiah. There must be another one coming that's going to happen too. I'm pretty happy about that. So Jesus says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Now listen to this. This is really something. The Jews therefore said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Wow. And listen to their reaction. It says, therefore they picked up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So that's just amazing. I mean, when you read something like that, you realize that people that say, "Oh, I think Jesus was great, but so was Muhammad and so was Buddha, and they're all great." No. Anybody that said something like this, there's only one or two things that can be true. Either that's true or that's false. And if that's true, it's time to bow. And if it's false, we got no time for him. Why should we pay attention to somebody that says something so outlandish like that? If that's not true, then Jesus of Nazareth is one of the most despicable people who've ever lived, saying something like that. Before Abraham was born, I am. But he was telling the truth. He was telling the truth. Well, we're almost out of time, so I do want to read the verse I promised to read you from James. This is chapter 2. James is writing, and he says, you see that faith was working with his works. He's talking about Abraham. Maybe I'll back up a verse. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. James is trying to make the point that you can't say that you've got faith and not live a good life. I mean, you can't say you got faith and then just live like a sinner. He says, as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. So, Abraham was the friend of God. He provided the beginning of this group of people called Jews who would carry God's revelation of the world and would provide the setting in which Jesus would live and die and be raised from the dead. And for us who are Gentiles, we can't claim a physical lineage to Abraham, but we can act like him. We can behave like he did. We can believe like he did. And that's what makes us children of Abraham. That was Jesus' whole point. He came for a new covenant. In the old covenant, it mattered who your mom and dad were. In the new covenant, it matters who your spiritual, what your spiritual parentage is. If you act like God, then you can rightly say you're of God. But you can't claim to be of God because of your ethnicity or because you declared it, I'm a Christian. No, it has to be because you behave like God behaved. And the first and foremost requirement of that behavior is to trust, is to believe, is to have faith. And I'll talk to you more about that next week. God bless you.